Afternoon to everyone, and thank you very much for coming to the keynote lectures, which is one of the highlights of this World Health Summit. My name is John Wong. I'm from the National University of Singapore, and my co-chair is Professor Christina Mitchell, who's Dean at Monash University, and we are both part of the M8 Alliance. We are really delighted to have two world luminaries as our keynote speakers. I will introduce the first, and I'll let Dr. Mitchell introduce Dr. Horton. So our first speaker is none other than Dr. Severin Schwan, who is Chief Executive Officer of Roche. And I think that nearly everybody in this room has worked with Roche in one capacity or another. Dr. Schwan obtained degrees in both economics and law and has been with Roche since 1993. I was just sharing with him that he has a link with Singapore. He was regional head of Roche Diagnostics for Asia Pacific and based in Singapore in 2004 and actually stayed about 2 streets away from me. That's my closest association with my closest link to fame here. But since 2000, Dr. Schwan went on to head Roche Diagnostics in 2006, and then in 2008 was appointed Chief Executive Officer of the whole Roche Group. And Dr. Schwan, thank you very much. And I think the topic of how we really need to stop wasting time to start tackling the enormous challenges that we have in terms of drug development. For those of you here this morning, we had a great session this morning, and I think this is a nice it's a nice follow-on.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a real pleasure to be here in Berlin. I truly believe, I'm absolutely convinced that it needs the collaboration of stakeholders across the healthcare spectrum to resolve the pressing issues we are facing, and I truly believe this platform of the Health Summit is exactly about that. Now, I understand we are a bit delayed in our agenda, so I'll try to really keep my presentation concise and skip over some of the slides so that afterwards we have the opportunity for some questions and a bit of a discussion based on this presentation. I'd really like to give you a bit of a perspective from the industry point of view to explain you how the pharma business model works from a commercial point of view, what makes us tick, and how we look at it. There's a number of challenges I'd like to address and then conclude with some thoughts on how we might mitigate those challenges. The pharma industry is really a very specific industry, and whenever I meet colleagues from other industries, they envy me because in our industry there's literally unlimited demand. Unlimited demand. 2/3 of diseases cannot be treated at all, and if you look at the existing medicines, then actually on average they do not work so well. Very often they are inadequate. In fact, on average, patients only respond 50% of the time to medicines. I mean, just imagine if you're in another industry, buy a car, for example, and you have a 50% chance that your engine starts. That's where we are about in our industry, and it is actually even worse in some disease areas like oncology or diseases of the central nervous system. It is fortunately better in other disease areas, such as analgesics. So unlimited demand in our industry. We all want to get older, and we all want to get older in good health. On the other hand, from an industry perspective, it is an extremely risky business. It takes at least $1 billion Swiss francs, $1 billion to get started with a new medicine. You start off with thousands of candidate molecules to hopefully end up with one medicine. And I emphasize hopefully. Could well be that you lose a medicine at a very late stage process. So we are in an industry where you have a huge upfront investment, and then you are protected for a certain time where you have exclusive rights. The backbone in our industry is intellectual property. Without intellectual property, there wouldn't be new medicines, full stop. Takes us about 10 years to bring a new medicine to the market, and on average we have another 10 years of exclusivity to finance and recoup our investments. Now that is very much the company point of view. What I'd like to emphasize, and typically this is forgotten in the public debate, perhaps because it's too long term, but let me emphasize it here, is the societal view. Now, I would argue there is value beyond the cost for our medicines during the time when there are still patents, when our pricing is protected. But what is certainly the case is that as soon as patents expires, our medicines get available for mankind forever for cents. And that is when the real societal value kicks in. And just to illustrate this with a couple of examples from our own company, we have been developing medicines now for over 100 years. And we have today 20 medicines on the WHO list of the so-called most essential medicines. All of those medicines today, this includes antibiotics, are generic today. Many of those we don't market ourselves anymore. They are marketed by many generic companies in the world, and millions of patients have benefited from those medicines, and millions of patients will benefit from these medicines for generations to come. I truly believe that this basic model around patent rights has proven to be extremely successful over the last decades. Now, what are the challenges in this model? And let me start off with it's almost an investor view. If I meet the financial community today, the number one topic out there is R&D productivity. If I talk with our investors, there is real concern today that the investments which the industry does in research and development is simply not paying back. Now, this is a serious issue, because if you don't have investors financing all of this R&D, if you don't have investors who believe in this industry, if you don't have investors who put money into this industry, then you can't do research and development, and eventually you won't have novel medicine. So this is a real serious issue. And if you look at this question from a more analytical point of view, you can see there is something about that. This is a number of independent studies which have been performed, and there are really two messages here. One is that indeed the return on research and development is declining over the last decades. But the even more important message here is that those studies suggest, and that of course is industry averages, that the return on R&D is now getting into the area of the cost of capital. And what that means for the financial specialists amongst you, investors will start taking their money and put it somewhere else, where they can earn a premium over the cost of capital. So this is a really, really alarming picture, if you like, and I think it's worthwhile to look at the underlying challenges. So let me get back to this overall model, and let me just quickly go through the challenges we are facing, and then perhaps deepen one or the other as we go on. Now, first of all, of course, it is very much about our ability to turn the progress of science into new innovations, into medicines. That is at the core of what we do. And we do this in collaboration with many partners, including academic institutions. On that front, actually, I'm most optimistic. There are some people around who would claim that all the low-hanging fruits have been harvested, the progress of science is at its end, and now, we are done. We have found all medicines which are out there. Now, I have a much, much more optimistic view here. I would claim that it's actually now, it is now, that we start to understand what goes wrong if you have a disease. It is now, with this revolution in genomics, that we start to understand molecular pathways, that we start to understand the root causes of what is going on if you have a disease. And based on these understandings, we will find many, many new targets. And based on this understanding, we will turn this scientific progress eventually into novel medicines. So it is the core of this equation here, but I'm pretty optimistic on it. Now, second, regulations. Of course, our industry is a highly regulated industry. After all, we put experimental medicines in humans. So it is very appropriate that this industry is heavily regulated, but as you will see in a moment, it has become increasingly complex for us, and of course that drives cost up. Thirdly, intellectual property. There's lots of discussions about intellectual property, but actually the truth is intellectual property and the protection of intellectual property has improved over the last decades. Over the last 20, 30 years, intellectual property and the protection of intellectual property has improved. A number of emerging markets have joined the WTO. As such, they have signed the respective international agreements. And very importantly, some of the emerging markets, if you take China, for example, they have this strategic intention to build up a local life science industry. And of course, the prerequisite for that is intellectual property. And as such, we see in a number of emerging markets an intrinsic, genuine interest to protect intellectual property. So even though there's a lot of discussion about that, I'm less worried about it, actually. And the last one is reimbursement pricing. And in more general terms, access to healthcare. I think this is a really, really critical point, and I will also cover this in more detail. Now, a quick word to regulations. Now, back in the 70s, it was about 1,000 pages to get a new product, a new medicine filed. 10 years later, it was 10,000 pages. In the 90s, the rough estimate on average was 100,000 pages. Today, it is more than 1 million pages, which we have to submit to each of the regulatory authorities to file for a new product. Now, I often ask myself, why is this the case? I mean, what is happening here? And I think the underlying reason for that is that the regulatory authorities, which is really a clinical approval, is hijacked by politicians. Clinicians know from the very start of their education that when you talk about medicines, it is a balance of efficacy and safety effects. If you talk with a clinician, this is the most natural thing for a clinician. A politician's view is completely different. He's not so worried about the incremental benefit of new medicines, which are not visible anyway for the electorate, but is extremely worried if there is one person dying from a new medicine, and then the politicians are held responsible. And what has happened is that the politicians have almost intruded, in particular in the US. The clinical regulatory process, the FDA is really under the supervision of the Congress, and as such, they have become so conservative that regulatory requirements have gone up dramatically, and the rest of the world follows the FDA. Now, let me shortly comment on that one. That's in particular interesting, I think, from a German and European perspective. The underlying issue with regulatory constraints is that we have one global clinical trial. Now, you need one global clinical trial, late-stage clinical trial, to file for a new medicine. So this is one trial. But you deal with national health authorities. And therefore, you get this enormous complexity, because the requirements can be very different of the national health authorities, and we have to deal with that. And naturally, in the European Union, where clinical trials are approved by the member states, you have the biggest complexity. What I'd like to add here is that on top of it, in Europe, I mean, just listen to that, we have more than 1,000 ethic committees on top of the national healthcare authorities, which we have to deal with and which we have to coordinate, and where we have to make sure that we balance all these requests and interests. Now, this is not a theoretical conceptual question. This is a really hands-on, tangible question for us. A company like ours spends about $7 billion into research and development every year. This is about 20% of our yearly sales. We have over 300,000 patients on trials, permanently on trials. I mean, imagine what complexities we have to deal with. I've just given an example here. If we look at this affinity trial, that's a medicine for breast cancer. It's a typical trial, 4,000 patients, 600 sites across 44 countries, and we have to deal with 300 review boards. So this is national authorities and ethics committees to do such a trial. And there are trials where you have up to 20,000 patients, so you can imagine how complex this can easily get. Now, my message on that slide, and then I close on the regulatory side, is the European Union is falling behind. As a global company, actually, it is not so relevant for me, because we will shift resources around the world wherever we have to and however we have to do to optimize the overall model. As an Austrian, as a European, it really, really hurts. It really hurts. And you see the consequences here. Clinical trials in Europe are going down by 25%, and all the related investments, of course, into hospitals, academic institutions, etc., are decreasing appropriately at the expense, in particular, of the Asian countries on the one hand, and also the US, because the US for us is just much, much easier to deal with. I'd just like to highlight that there is an ongoing discussion on a European level to harmonize the clinical trial regulations. I really hope that we make progress here, but you can imagine, I mean, all these committees on a national basis, on a hospital basis, etc., are all afraid that they lose influence and power, and as such, we already see a lot of resistance upcoming. But let's hope that moves into the right direction. Let me just comment on the pricing issue. I think there is really a major shift underway, and I think it is really a very, very important topic. Traditionally, if you look into the pricing in the pharmaceutical industry, we had one global uniform price across the world. And what that meant, and what it means today to a large degree, is that a few patients in the rich countries have access to the medicines, either because they pay out of pocket or because there is a reimbursement on the state level. And many, many countries around the world have a very, very poor access, or patients in these countries have a very, very poor access to medicines. I've just here one example. That's a real example where we stand today. Herceptin is again a breast cancer drug. And you can see the penetration rates for that medicine is still very, very low. So most of the patients in countries like China or India would not be able to afford this medicine. This medicine is standard of care in the developed countries. So in Germany, every single patient would be treated by this medicine for that specific disease. Now, what's the way out? Obviously, as an industry, we cannot just simply give the medicines away for free. You have seen where R&D return is going to start with. It wouldn't be a sustainable model. But I think there is a way out, and it's simply what I refer to as tiered pricing or differentiated pricing. And that means that you have different prices for different countries according to the respective purchasing power. Very simple. But there's one prerequisite for that, and that is the solidarity between the rich countries and the poor countries. Because if you provide your medicines, and we would be more than willing to do that, at a low price to a country with a low income and a low purchasing power, but at the same time a rich country is knocking on your door and says, I want exactly the same price. Then what happens is, whether you like it or not, we will go back to uniform global prices, and we are back into this trap where most of the patients actually around this world will not be able to have access to our medicines. So it's a lot about solidarity, and perhaps I just conclude with one comment. Again, Europe, I'm picking a bit on Europe today, and that is about the specific institutions which we have in Europe, and I do believe we have to start to crack that. Europe is not uniform. I mean, income levels in Europe are very, very different, and with all this euro crisis, financial, economic crisis, probably these differences will only get bigger. Now, we have Romania on the one hand, we have Greece on the one hand, we have Scandinavian countries, Germany, Netherlands on the other hand. There's huge differences here. To pretend that Europe is one economic area with one income level is simply not true. But when it comes to pricing, what happens is the European prices do reference pricing to other European countries, and guess what? Typically to the countries where you have the lowest price. There is zero solidarity to start with. And then you have a second element, which is a real issue, and that is parallel trade. Now, parallel trade is a holy sacred cow in Europe, and it makes a lot of sense if you have a free market and if you have free pricing, because obviously you maximize the benefits for consumers. But it's a complete contradiction to have parallel trade when you have national pricing. I mean, why do I negotiate the price with you for a specific country if I tell afterwards to my payers, import the stuff via parallel traders from the cheapest country in Europe? I mean, it's absurd. It is literally absurd. And I predict if we don't get our hands around that, we will have increasingly access problems, not only in emerging countries, but also in Europe. And there would be simple ways out of that. To conclude on a positive note, in Germany, actually, what has happened now with the new price regulations is that it has been put into the law that the reference pricing considers the purchasing power of the countries where the price is referenced to. That's a first. We'll see how this all will be implemented, but it's actually a very positive sign into this direction. And I find more and more people on the European level who also believe that parallel trade is not the right design for a market where prices are centrally regulated. I skip this one. So to conclude, at the core is the progress of science. I'm very optimistic about that one. On the regulatory side, it is important that we have independent regulatory authorities which are run by clinicians and not by politicians. I think there is need in Europe to further harmonize regulations when it comes to clinical trials. On the IP side, I'm pretty optimistic. I think with the build-up of local life science industries in emerging markets, that will actually strengthen over time because it's in the very interest of those countries. And on the reimbursement side, my pledge is for tiered pricing. Thank you very much. I'm not sure, John, do we still have time for one or the other question? We do. Very good.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Schwan, for a great analysis of an extremely complex problem. So we've got maybe a few minutes for questions. Can I ask if? So maybe, Dr. Schwan, can I just ask? I've always thought that the pharmaceutical industry is probably in one of the most difficult industries, whereby you have to show that every new product is better than the last one.
Yes.
And with generics coming out and constantly having to raise the bar each time, it does perhaps call for a new model for intellectual property, because I don't think there's any other industry that I'm aware of whereby the new product must be better and have to go through all the regulatory hoops say the pharmaceutical industry has to go through.
Now, I don't see this as a concern. I think that's at the very nature of our business, and I actually find it quite exciting. And I find it I find it a good challenge to have, that we have to progress science, that we have to come up with better novel medicines which really make a difference versus the current standard of care, which truly add additional life, which improve the quality of life. I think this is a good challenge to have. And, whenever you bring a new medicine to the market, I can tell you from my experience, it is an enormous satisfaction to see what a difference you can make for patients. So personally, I think this model around the protection of intellectual property, which eventually is the incentive system to keep the industry going, has served us extremely well.
Yes, please. Can you just introduce yourself, please?
Ian Roberts from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Your analysis of the drivers of increasing regulation is public and political pressure for safety. I've got a different perspective. In clinical trials, there's a group of businesses inserted themselves into the process who do not have the objective of bringing safe and effective medicines to the world. In particular, organizations like clinical research organizations who actually thrive off complexity. They make the system complex and then say, we'll sort it out for you. So that's one analysis. And the ICH GCP, complete and utter, unmitigated disaster. It should be abolished. It was a mistake. So that's I'd like a response on that. The second thing is that we must be clear that ethics committees are not there to protect patients. They're there to protect institutions from lawyers. And we need to say that much more clearly. We've got evidence in the CRASH 2 clinical trial that ethics committees, by insisting on consent from relatives in emergency situations, actually killed patients in the trial because they delayed the treatment, and treatment early was much more effective than treatment late. So I think ethics committees and CROs, I would direct some of my energy against. What do you think?
What I certainly can confirm is that specifically in the US, the legal framework I consider as a cost of doing business. I have to accept it. The US have chosen that system, and it is supported by the population eventually. Otherwise, I would hope that it would get better, at least from my European point of view, my European legal background point of view. But it is what it is, and we see it as a cost of doing business. So I've talked about the complexity in Europe in terms of, the sheer number of authorities we have to deal with. But certainly when it comes to the legal system, Europe is at an advantage in a much more balanced, reasonable system than the US. As far as CROs are concerned, I wonder whether there is a representative of a CRO here in the room to directly answer the question. It's a bit difficult to do that on behalf of the CROs. Is there a CRO here? No? I wouldn't be able to comment on that. We do have one at the very top.
No, it was a comment from you, really, because you pay their wages.
Yeah, good. I mean, certainly you can be assured that we as an industry are not interested to increase the complexity. I mean, your suggestion is that the CROs kind of make it more complex to have higher revenues. I'm not sure whether I would go so far, but at any rate, I do think that CROs have a role to play, and the reason for that is that you have fluctuations in your resource needs. And if you constantly have to, recruit internal resources to be able to do a trial, and then, if you have this volatility, have to dismiss people again, recruit people again, etc. I do not think that would be much more efficient. I think that would not serve the purpose. A discussion which we have with CROs is, and that goes a bit into your direction perhaps, is can we better align between the companies and the CROs? Because what happens today is that, a company says, please CRO do this or that, and they duplicate the whole infrastructure. So the question is, could we better align to avoid the overlap, and by working better together with different stakeholders, take out unnecessary infrastructure? So I guess there are opportunities. On the ethics committees, I mean, there's just no doubt whatsoever that we need ethics committees. I think that is unquestioned. The question is, do we need so many? I mean, do we have such big differences in Europe that we need 1,000 different ethics committees? Are the differences and the ethical views on how you conduct a clinical trial in Europe really so different that you need so many? And that I would doubt.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I think to keep on time, we'll have to move on to the next speaker. But thank you very much, Dr. Schwan. And